I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we're discussing a critical aspect of China's governance. How is China handling its internal security? Outsiders know very little about the Chinese state security apparatus. How does the CCP leadership approach its internal security policies? And how does China's domestic security efforts impact Chinese foreign policy? Joining us today is Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens. Dr. Greitens is Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs UT's Asia Policy Program. Her research focuses on security, authoritarian politics and foreign policy in East Asia. Currently, Dr. Greitens is on leave to serve as a visiting associate professor of research in Indo-Pacific Security at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. She is also concurrently a non-resident scholar with the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you for joining us today, Sheena.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's start by discussing what is China's national security apparatus. What organizations does it involve, and what are the primary roles and objectives?
It's a great question. So China's national security apparatus, I think of it as the system that Xi Jinping has put in place to build out, implement, move forward his vision for national security, which he laid out starting in 2014 under the framework of what he called the comprehensive national security concept, sometimes translated as comprehensive state security concept, overall national security outlook. There's probably a half dozen different ways that concept gets translated. But I really see that as the intellectual core of his way of thinking about national security. And it's also something that he's translated institutionally, legally, and in policy into a national security system within the Chinese political system that's become increasingly important over time. National security has become one of Xi Jinping's contributions and one of the signature initiatives of his 2, now 3 terms in power. That approach to national security has a couple of key features. First of all, it's very broad. So Xi Jinping started in 2014 with about 13 or 14 different components of national security, and that number is multiplied. I think we're up to almost twice that today. So over 20 different components of national security, everything from the more traditional components like homeland security, border security, things that we as Americans might associate with our national security framework, to things that are much less traditional components of security: energy security, food security, data security, economic, energy, food security, right? That cluster of issues. So the first thing to know about this concept of national security and the national security apparatus is that it has a very broad scope. And almost anything can be dealt with using the national security toolkit or players in the Chinese political system. Second, that vision of national security sees internal and external security as very closely related, but it includes a lot more internal security components than we in the American national security community might think of as part of national security. That matters because the sort of foundation of national security in the comprehensive national security concept in Xi Jinping's intellectual framework for national security is what the CCP calls political security, which in turn is defined as the security of China's socialist system, the authority of the CCP Central Committee, and Xi Jinping as the core of that system. And so it is fundamentally a regime security concept, a security concept for the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power and its leadership, rather than the sort of national security divorced from a particular political party or leader. And so I think those are the sort of really key characteristics of the national security apparatus that Xi Jinping has constructed during his time so far in power.
Thank you, Sheena. Given what you described, 20-plus components of national security, what are the major or most important players in China's national security system?
I think the scope has broadened a bit over time as the concept has expanded, and an increasing number of actors in the Chinese political system have responsibility for national security. We see language to that effect, especially around the passage of the counter-espionage law last year, which I'm happy to come back to. But the key players are really, we're talking about what in Chinese would be called the political legal apparatus, which includes the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the court system, the procuracy, the parts of the Ministry of Justice, the folks who run prisons and policing and law enforcement. But then it also does touch on two other parts of the Chinese political system, the PLA and party control over the PLA, which is a key part of Xi Jinping's vision of political security, and then the disciplinary apparatus. So one of the organizational changes that Xi Jinping made that was linked back to the comprehensive national security concept was to reorganize the organizations that do discipline and supervision to create a very powerful discipline and supervision apparatus in the party state that has handled a lot of the anti-corruption campaigns and therefore has been responsible for removing and changing a lot of the personnel turnover we've seen in the military, in the security apparatus, in the Ministry of Public and State Security, and elsewhere in the party state has been because of this enhanced discipline and supervision authority that Xi Jinping has created. And so I think those are, broadly speaking, who the key players are.
And how does the Central National Security Commission fit within all of this?
So the Central National Security Commission was created in 2014 when the comprehensive national security concept was launched, and it's the body that is chaired by Xi Jinping that oversees national security work. It's a party body, and one of the interesting things, again, about this sort of organizational overhaul of the national security apparatus that Xi Jinping has done is that the Central National Security Commission has now been replicated at various levels of the party state down to the local level. So there's a provincial national security commission. They meet and are responsible for national security issues in their particular area, as well as things like public education around national security, which has been one of the recent priorities of Xi Jinping's national security effort, more effort put toward citizen awareness, mobilization, and public education around what national security is and how citizens are responsible for contributing to it.
Thank you, Sheena. Before delving into China's security apparatus, I think it will be useful to have a comparative perspective. How does China view national security compared to other countries, especially authoritarian countries like Russia and North Korea? What is unique or different about China's view or China's system?
I would say that the attention given to overhauling, reorganizing, and creating new national security frameworks, whether that's in organizations, law, policy, personnel, that the Chinese government and party state have really been out in front in terms of how proactive and how revisionist they've been willing to be to their own system, even compared to places like Russia and North Korea. The interesting part, though, is that I do think we see some convergence in thinking between Beijing and Moscow, or Beijing and Pyongyang. I did some work about 2 years ago where I looked at North Korea's model of basically what is called in Vietnam Market Leninism, and in North Korea, or in China, among China scholars, party state capitalism. And it's this model of trying to use different tools in a Leninist political system to blend some market mechanisms in the economy with strong political control by a Leninist party. And, North Korea has, I think, increasingly moved toward the Chinese model of doing that, even as China has tightened party control and regulatory authority over certain sectors of the economy. I also think we see some convergence with places like Russia. If you look at one of the things that was new in that infamous February 2022 joint statement by China and Russia that included the no limits partnership language, that joint statement talked specifically about the shared interests that Russia and China had in combating the threat of external interference, subversion, the threat of color revolutions in their common adjacent regions, I believe was the phrasing. I would want to go back and double check, but that's broadly what the concept was. And you see, I think, that there's a shared fear about what could threaten regime security why the United States having alliances and partnerships on the respective borders of China and Russia was considered a threat. And it wasn't just that it was an external conventional military threat, it was actually framed in the language of a threat to regime security. So again, and I don't want to overstate because these are different political systems, they operate somewhat differently, their security sectors are organized a little bit differently, but I do think that we see some very interesting points of convergence. It's also true of somewhere like Vietnam, which is increasingly using language like prevent and control, which is one of Xi Jinping's signature phrases about his approach that I've seen in official comments by Vietnamese senior party and internal security leaders as well. So I think we are seeing some interesting shared approaches or cooperation and convergence among these powers. Again, don't want to overstate it, but it's definitely there and worth watching.
Sheena, you mentioned most of the major changes that we've seen have occurred under Xi Jinping, and you flagged 2014 as a major year of change. To what extent have we seen increased PRC threat perceptions under Xi that we didn't see in his predecessors? So in other words, how much are what we are seeing right now in China, the perceived PRC threat perception, how much of that is a result of Xi Jinping and his own worldviews?
Yeah, it's a great and really tricky question to try to answer. My read of Chinese rhetoric is that Xi Jinping saw from, around 2014, from some of his early statements, more risks to the Chinese political system and more concern than maybe previous leaders had. And again, particularly related to this sort of sense of non-traditional security and the risk that external developments could destabilize party rule at home. It seems to me that darker view of China's external and internal security environment has not gone away. He uses the phrase complicated, the most complicated environment in the CCP's history. Not necessarily the worst, right? The Long March was pretty grim, but most complicated. And what I think is really interesting and maybe counterintuitive for a lot of us who are watching China is that if you actually look at some of what Xi Jinping says, greater power does not seem to lead to greater security. It actually in some ways leads to greater risk and greater vulnerability. There's a very interesting dialectical framing of that even as the opportunities and the gains for China get better and it gets closer to accomplishing the goal of national rejuvenation, that resistance will increase, that the difficulty and the struggle will increase. It's very dialectical, but that runs a bit maybe counter to people who might look at China and say, it's gained so much in power. How does that lead it to be insecure? But again, I also think we need to remember that this is about regime insecurity and not necessarily about raw national power. Raw national power doesn't always solve regime security concerns in a non-democracy. And so there are a couple of interesting factors that I think shape Xi Jinping's threat perceptions. But to be honest, we sometimes, I think, struggle to understand a bit how Chinese leaders view the evolution of the threat environment and what the pathway to security might be for them. I think the comprehensive national security concept gives us a roadmap, but that concept was pretty vague and has been put into practice bits and pieces at a time over the course of a decade. So I think it's easy to look at disparate parts of those policy changes or organizational changes and not link them back to the same fundamental underlying vision and concept of regime security. But I think it's important to try to do that because it gives us an overarching framework and a guide by which to try to understand not just what China's already done, but where it might be headed next.
Thank you, Sheena. I really like your point about how greater power does not necessarily lead to greater security. Do you have a sense of how Xi Jinping or the CCP leadership prioritizes China's national security threats? I'm not aware of any one document that authoritatively lists the threats that China faces, but is there a broad understanding of what the top threats are or a broad understanding of how the threats are prioritized?
We get a sense, I think, of what those issues are, but prioritization is in some ways a challenge with a concept that is as broad as Xi Jinping has made the comprehensive national security concept. And I think that actually creates some issues, especially for leaders, Chinese leaders or politicians at the local level who are tasked with implementing national security as well as economic growth performance metrics at this point, because it clouds the system a little bit around sort of what the objectives and the deliverables that will that the system is trying to incentivize are. So I actually think you've hit on one of the key issues here, which is that absent very clear prioritization and deprioritization, you're going to get this sort of gradual creeping securitization, which, there's been some internal discussion in China of maybe we should think about what the healthy or productive limits to that are. But that's a very difficult conversation to have. And there are very strong countervailing forces, I think, that are pushing toward this protection of national security that come directly from the top of the Chinese political system and from Xi Jinping himself. So I think that the creeping securitization of issues in China is largely the result of this broad conceptual framework that doesn't appear to have a lot of self-limiting mechanisms built into it.
Thank you. I understand there is no clear hierarchy of the threats that China faces, but could you walk us through some of the major challenges that Beijing has identified? A couple of items that we often hear are internal challenges like social unrest and economic inequality. And you also mentioned economic security as well as legitimacy of the CCP as top priorities. To what extent does Xi and the Chinese leadership really view themselves as significantly under threat right now?
So I think that social unrest has long been a real concern from the standpoint of political security for the CCP. I see less of a change in the underlying concern about social unrest and more adaptation in how the CCP thinks that it should address those issues. And there I would identify a couple of changes in the way the approach has evolved. First, Xi Jinping's approach is highly preventive. So we rarely sometimes we'll still hear the language of stability maintenance, but there was actually some discussion at one point among the internal security officials about the sort of implied that stability maintenance was too reactive. And instead, you often hear this language of prevention and control and the need to treat root causes, not just symptoms, when it comes to challenges to domestic security or to political security. So I think the first change in the approach is that it has become even more highly preventive. We see a lot of medical metaphors, particularly around the time of the mass establishment of re-education camps in Xinjiang on an expanded scale. The other thing is that that's often the justification for the use of technology. So in 2015, a year after Xi Jinping promulgated the comprehensive national security concept, the State Council and the CCP Central Committee issued a directive that included a phrase about aiming for multidimensional information-based prevention and control system for public and social security, which is kind of a mouthful and basically is a shorthand for not just the surveillance state, but the back-end platforms that take data gathered via human and technical surveillance and pull it in and try to actually make it usable in governance. So things like the surveillance state come out of this shift toward greater prevention, as well as the expansion of the technological tools available for prevention and control during the time Xi Jinping has been in power. With respect to economic security, we've clearly seen a shift in the discourse around economics and security, rather than assuming that development will lead organically to security in places like Xinjiang or Tibet. Xi Jinping has explicitly repudiated that premise now and says, no, security is the precondition for development, or security is the foundation of development. At other times, he uses a more balanced metaphor, just saying that's kind of two wings on one bird, two wheels on one cart. It's a little bit tricky to translate, but the idea is that these concepts have to be interdependent, or if anything, that security actually takes sort of temporal and analytical primacy. It comes first. And so on economic security, what I see increasingly is, okay, the goal isn't necessarily to maximize growth right now. We're actually willing to, as the Chinese party state, take a lower growth rate and maybe take an economic hit in the short term in order to protect long-term economic security. So I actually see it more as a trade-off across different time horizons when it comes to economic security and how we think about China's approach. Those are some of the key ways in which that I think Xi Jinping tries to tackle some of these changes to domestic security. The other thing I'll say is, Xi Jinping has pretty consistently used the language of color revolutions and blamed internal instability on external black hands, foreign subversion, etc. If you look at, for example, the Ministry of State Security Weixin account, that comes up a bit. I'm probably understating there. But one of the ways to interpret some of the changes Xi Jinping has made, again, gradually or incrementally, piecemeal over the course of a decade, is to close off potentially destabilizing avenues of foreign influence. So if you look at the foreign NGO law, if you look at the tightening of business, if you look at constraints put on journalists, if you look at places like Xinjiang, where there was particularly transnational religiously based communication, if you look at Hong Kong, that has always been considered a particular site of concern about external infiltration or foreign subversion. Right? So both geographically and functionally in different sectors of Chinese society, we've seen an effort to basically seal off, or at least control, potentially destabilizing vectors of foreign influence. And I think that's another key piece of the way that China has tried to approach and manage some of these security threats in this, again, very broad framework that Xi Jinping has constructed.
Thank you. There are 2 points that I want to follow up on. The first that you mentioned, which is really important, is that Xi's approach has become more preventive and less reactive, and he wants to address the root cause, not the symptoms. Given this, has he encountered any pushback domestically, potentially from folks within the Chinese bureaucracy or from Chinese public intellectuals? It seems that to be preventive, you have to actually be more proactive in dealing with national security. Do you find that to be the case? The second point I wanted to follow up on is you mentioned the balance between economic growth and economic security. I think that's an area where there's a big difference between taking a more proactive versus reactive approach. Could you unpack that a little bit to discuss if you're seeing any pushback at all within China on what Xi Jinping and the CCP are currently doing?
With respect to your question about this debate or possible debate over economics versus security, let me start by acknowledging that the Chinese political system has become increasingly opaque, and we've lost some of the sources of information that scholars and analysts often had to try to understand lines of debate or discussions about trade-offs within the Chinese political system as policies were being developed and implemented and feedback collected on how that affects the system's performance. So we don't have a lot of great information about whether or not there's internal pushback within the system to this prioritization of security. But there have been some interesting clues in the official statements released by different actors in the Chinese political system recently that suggest that maybe there's some concern at senior levels over whether or not tools like the counter-espionage law have created an unfriendly business environment in China. Again, with a security justification that the party state might consider valid, but with costs that maybe weren't fully anticipated with respect to foreign investment or overall economic performance. Again, this is guesswork and speculative, but there have been some recent statements that make me wonder if there's a discussion about that that's going on that we simply don't have good visibility on. With respect to pushback on other policies, like the Chinese leadership's escalation of repression in Xinjiang, certainly I think there's been vocal disapproval and criticism from human rights advocates and Uyghurs who've left China, or the family members of people who remain in China imprisoned or incommunicado, and so are reliant on outside voices to advocate for them. A number of UN rapporteurs some years ago released a statement of concern that criticized China's behavior and its policies in Xinjiang because they were disproportionate to the potential perceived threat. One of the things that's actually fascinating about China's use of medical metaphors and metaphors like immunization that are highly preventive is that we don't typically vaccinate people for illnesses they've already had. We vaccinate them before they've even been exposed or showed any symptoms. And so that medical metaphor of immunization really makes clear that China's behavior in Xinjiang is targeting people who haven't done anything to warrant that scrutiny or certainly that targeted repression that they're subsequently subject to. And I think the use of these preventive metaphors really makes that clear and explains some of the criticism that China has received for its policies there. But again, that criticism has largely come from external voices. Whether or not criticism would be more vocal and more frequent if people were in an environment where they felt like they could speak freely about their opinions, we simply don't know. I would guess that that's probably the case, that there would be more vocal criticism if the environment was not so repressive. But what happens in spaces where domestic political voices are shut down or threatened is that often it's left to actors on the outside, members of the diaspora or others, to voice those criticisms. And that seems to be what we are seeing, again, largely in places like Tibet and Xinjiang.
And what else is China doing in addition to being proactive? Have you seen under Xi Jinping the punishment go up for what China views as offenses in the national security realm? In other words, if actors take the same sort of action that are deemed either as a crime or politically problematic, have you seen the punishment or what they suffer as a result of those actions increase under Xi Jinping?
One of the really challenging features of a highly preventive concept of social control, like the one that Xi Jinping uses, is that it actually moves the party state's use of repression earlier and into more private spaces, which makes it intrinsically harder for outside observers to catch, to measure, and to analyze. So, for example, rather than having a mass public crackdown on a protest, the police might go and detain the organizers in their homes before they even get out to the street where someone could see and observe repression occurring. And so I think this is part of the challenge that we have, is that as Xi Jinping has moved the party state toward this more preventive concept, it's also become harder to observe the acts of repression themselves and to know how their frequency and scale are changing. And that, combined with the broader loss of some of the information that we used to have about the internal and social dynamics of popular participation or mobilization at the grassroots level in China, has posed a real analytical challenge for those of us who want to understand these dynamics in the Chinese political system.
Perhaps another ramification of preventive action is that your average Chinese citizen may not necessarily see how much resentment or how much unhappiness there is if the CCP is really successful at preventing protests before they occur. And as a result, there's a decrease in the ability for collective action or mobilization.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Certainly, I think the more controlled a political environment is, the more citizens believe that the party state has the ability to detect what they're doing ahead of time and stop them and impose a punishment, and the more likely they may be to be deterred from doing anything to challenge either a local or national authority or policy at all. But that also creates increased informational problems for the internal security apparatus, because the more preference falsification they induce, the more trouble they're going to have understanding what people are really upset about and what their threshold for acting on it might actually be. And so I think that actually one way to read what happened with the zero COVID protests is that the security apparatus had been relatively successful at one goal, the short-term suppression, but that it may have missed the long-term buildup of some pretty intense dissatisfaction with the consequences of that policy that then bubbled over into public in multiple localities simultaneously. So it's really a double-edged sword for the CCP. It does not necessarily appear to be one, at least by any public sources that I see the regime grappling with, but it's a well-known dynamic in authoritarian political systems, and I don't expect that China would be exempt.
And to deal with this problem that China is facing, how are you seeing artificial intelligence and increased surveillance technology being used? You mentioned earlier that technology was a key factor in China's control on society and its ability to understand what's going on. In what ways are you seeing Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership starting to rely heavily on artificial intelligence and surveillance technology?
There's no question that there's been a very large buildup and investment in the surveillance state under Xi Jinping. A lot of that has been funded and organized at the local level, and so we've seen some problems with aggregating and integrating the data from these various platforms. And I also think it's important to note that even the most technologically advanced surveillance systems in the world, I would put China's among them, or the East German Stasi during the height of the Cold War, they didn't ever let go of the sort of human dimension of surveillance, and whether that's a feature of, again, of Leninist political systems or just a recognition that data collected via technical means still requires some level of human interpretation. I don't know. But even as we've seen this push to invest in surveillance and big data analytics on the back end and things like that, China hasn't really let go of the older, more traditional human inputs and aspect of its societal surveillance programs. And I think that's an important piece to just flag for listeners and for people who are watching this system, that it's easy to focus on the tech at the point of collection, but that misses a little bit just how many humans are involved in administering this and making the surveillance state function as well.
Thank you, Sheena. Let me now transition to look at foreign policy. From your perspective, how does China's prioritization of national security change China's foreign policy, if at all? And a related question, and one that we often get at CSIS, is how does China's internal stability increase or decrease China's willingness to use military force abroad?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that question. Let me answer the later question first about how internal security concerns or perceived threat might increase or decrease China's willingness to be assertive or militarily aggressive abroad. First of all, I think the impact on Chinese foreign policy of these internal security dynamics has grown over time. In some ways, that's actually to be expected because a lot of Xi Jinping's thinking attributes internal instability or domestic security challenges to external forces, to black hands, to foreign subversion, etc. And because his approach is so highly preventive, if you believe that the sources of your domestic security problems are abroad and you want to prevent the source of that problem or get to the origin of that problem, then it has to have a foreign policy component and an external dimension to solving your domestic security challenges. And so the answer to your question is that if China believes that some of the sources of its internal instability have origins externally that have to be addressed, then I think it will be willing to be more assertive in addressing those challenges abroad and simultaneously more repressive at home. I actually think that is the sort of fundamental issue that explains much of Xi Jinping's combination of increased repressiveness at home and increased assertiveness abroad. It's very different from a concept that's sometimes been in U.S. national security strategies, where we see discussion of, okay, we've got domestic challenges at home, so we're going to pare back and retrench and focus on challenges at home first. In some ways, this is the opposite correlation. Then with respect to your question about, how does this show up in PRC foreign policy concretely? Because I said earlier that I think that it increasingly has affected and shaped Chinese foreign policy over time. There are a couple of ways in which that's happened. First, Xi Jinping started saying in the late 2010s that he wanted the internal security apparatus to adopt a more global vision for state security work or national security work. And the international security apparatus responded. I think that we've been a little bit slow to view China's internal security leaders as foreign policy actors, but in my view, they are. I have a piece coming out later this spring in Parameters, a journal with the Army War College, that looks at the international diplomatic engagements of China's top internal security officials, the Minister of Public Security, the head of the Central Political Legal Commission, and some other folks. And, they are very active international diplomats. And so I think we need to start considering them not just as domestic police chiefs or internal security czars, but as foreign policy players in China's international and foreign security policy. The other piece where this is really showing up in Chinese foreign policy is in the implementation of the Global Security Initiative. And I know that when GSI was rolled out, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that it was vague and a lot of the components kind of sounded like things that Chinese leaders had said before. Coincidentally, that was also true of the comprehensive national security concept, but the purpose of the comprehensive national security concept was not to be a wholly new idea. It was to provide the intellectual architecture for what's been a pretty transformative approach to security and internal security under Xi Jinping. And I think GSI is starting to get traction, and we're starting to see some of the bigger changes in the world that may result from this framework that China laid out, again, in fairly vague and loose form in its statements and proposals about GSI. One of the arguments GSI makes is that the current global security architecture, which it largely attributes to the US, is inadequate for dealing with contemporary global security challenges, particularly non-traditional security challenges that have to do with public order, public safety, and non-traditional security threats. And so China puts forward its own proposals under GSI. And what's really interesting is that as more and more countries sign up for GSI, I think we're up to 70 or 75 countries that have expressed some level of rhetorical support for GSI to date. As we see more and more countries sort of accept these principles in GSI, we also see an increasing number of bilateral security cooperation agreements that are where the rubber meets the road and some of the implementation and security cooperation starts happening. So take Hungary, for example. It's a European country whose external security is provided for by NATO, nonetheless just signed a security cooperation pact with China. And I have some work now with Isaac Carden that looks at why is that? Why does China find security cooperation from both the United States and China appealing? And the answer is that China is providing assistance on regime security concerns that are very consistent with its own comprehensive national security concept and that might be appealing to Orban particularly as the head of a backsliding democracy, and that the United States is not in the business of generally providing. So it's law enforcement, it's policing, it's other types of internal security assistance that China has developed a comparative advantage in, particularly if you don't care about democracy and the rule of law, but also for a broader array of non-traditional security challenges that high-end conventional defense cooperation with the United States isn't necessarily focused on addressing. And so again, I think as China develops some more robust, practical cooperation under GSI, we're likely to see more and more of these types of security cooperation arrangements. And it's really interesting because I think that we're seeing a shift in the global security environment. The United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War each had their client states to whom they provided both internal and external security. Very few states crossed that Cold War divide. The United States largely took itself out of the internal security assistance game, mostly on human rights and grounds and concerns about repression. But we're now in an international environment, therefore, where you see these different but very overlapping types of security arrangements that third countries are pursuing with both the US and China. It's a fundamental difference from the Cold War, and it'll be very interesting to see how that international security environment and landscape evolves. I think it's going to pose some real challenges for American and international security policymakers, and it'll be interesting to see how those trends develop.
Thank you, Sheena, for such a fascinating discussion on how China views national security and how China's internal security could impact Beijing's foreign policy. Your point on how she may link domestic and foreign policy developments together is a really important one, and it's also what makes analyzing China so difficult. Thank you again for joining us.